is welcome. To say thank you all for joining us tonight for this very important and timely conversation. I think it's only fitting that we opened this discussion with a screening of A Brilliant Genocide, and I just want to acknowledge the tremendous work and effort that Ebony Butler put into the shooting of this documentary. I think a lot of us know and understand some of the challenges that journalists and filmmakers face on the ground trying to tell the truth. And it's unfortunate she's not with us here tonight, but we have a number of folks who are featured in the film who will be giving us some expertise in terms of how we understand the Great Gates crisis. I wanted to open up by just reflecting on some of the themes, and forgive me, my name is Tiffany Wheatland, I'll be your moderator for this evening. Before I introduce the panelists, I want to highlight some of the things covered in the film A Brilliant Genocide. I think that many Americans are all too familiar with the atrocities of the Rwandan genocide, of some of the atrocities of the 20th and 21st centuries. But we're here tonight to learn about a lesser known atrocity, one among many, but particularly we've just learned the story of the genocide of the Acholi of northern Uganda. That is a story that's gone virtually unreported. I would say underreported, but in the West, I don't think you'll find it in mainstream media, which makes it all the more critical that we have exposés as the one we've just seen tonight to help carry that truth to our eyes and ears. I'm going to, throughout the evening, bring us back to a couple of themes. U.S. foreign policy. One thing that I think is striking about the film we witnessed tonight, aside from the sheer loss of life and the brutality with which the genocide of the Acholi was carried out, is the fact that our taxpayers' dollars, yours and mine, are financing Yoweri Museveni, Paul Kagame, and so many others. Strongmen, we call them on the continent. And what that means, by extension, we are in some ways complicit in the atrocities we've just witnessed, and so I want us to meditate on that. But besides the theme of U.S. foreign policy, I think we see across the continent a wave of new leaders, the new breed of leaders as we'll discuss in a moment. Strong men, as they are sometimes characterized, who have been allowed to behave with impunity, both against their own people, but against neighboring countries as well. And I think it's important that we understand what that means and what those implications are, the implications of strong men for development on the continent. What is the role of the West in supporting these leaders? In particular, when we think about the U.S. and our role in promoting democracy around the world, we profess to want to promote democracy, but we often see that our dollars support tyrants and tyranny around the world. That's another thing that we'll come back to this evening. So without further ado, I want to begin by introducing our first speaker, Professor Milton Allimadi. Some of his students are here. Many of you may know him. He is a frequent commentator on all things Uganda. Professor Allimadi is the founding publisher of the Black Star News, a Pan-African news publication. He happens to be a member of the faculty department. I'm proud to say he's a colleague of mine at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. He teaches in the African Studies department, where he teaches courses on African history in particular. He's the author of The Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. And I'll just let everyone know from the outset that we have a number of stellar books this evening that are for sale just outside, so please don't forget to pick one up before you leave. Professor Allimadi is going to speak to us tonight from a couple of points. He's going to speak a bit about the film and the impetus for the development of the film. But he'll also speak a little bit about the ICC and their failure to effectively really to bring Museveni to account for his crimes. He'll speak a bit about what we call, the talk has been titled, This New Breed of Leaders on the Continent, and the implications for them as strong men, as we've discussed. Those who are not held accountable, who are allowed to govern with impunity. and the role that the United States has played in propping up these leaders. Following Professor Allimadi, we'll have a presentation by Dr. Epstein, Helen Epstein. She teaches at Bard College, and she's the author of Another Fine Mess, a very rich account of what we'll discuss tonight. Crimes committed by Paul Kagame and his regime, and the crisis of the Great Lakes region and the role of the West in supporting these leaders. In her spare time, she happens to be a writer and a molecular biologist on the side. I like to think of Helen as someone who, in her full-time capacity, is an advocate on behalf of issues relating to the DRC, but in her former life, she was also a molecular biologist. She's an independent consultant that specializes in public health in developing countries. Judi Rever comes to us from Canada, National Canada. She is here, joins us. She's a freelancer, actually, and a broadcast journalist who began her career with Radio France Internationale. She writes for the Toronto Globe and Mail, and is currently the author of In Praise of Blood, The Crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. I was fortunate to receive a copy of her book. Stunning cover, actually, stunning book. A very difficult account of the crimes of the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And I'm sure she'll speak more about this in a few moments. Claude joins us tonight. He's a Rwandan genocide survivor, which I think is a very rare account, to be able to hear testimony firsthand from victims of these sorts of atrocities. Claude is the founder of the Great Lakes Action Network. He's executive director and co-founder of the African Great Lakes Network, an organization which focuses on peace, prosperity in the Great Lakes region of Africa. I believe he's based in Nashville, is that right? Welcome. Following the presentations of the panel, we will have a period for Q&A. And so I would encourage everyone to please stay to the end and continue the rich dialogue that we expect to follow after the presentations. So without further ado, I will pass on to Professor Allimadi.
Thank you. Sisters and brothers, thank you for coming. And I always start by apologizing that you have to watch a film like this. But then I say, it's better that the story is being told. The victims, you could see the sense of relief when they were being interviewed. You saw the lady who was in exile, who was crying while she was being interviewed, as she recalled the story and she was trying to tell it to Ebony. So I think we should give Ebony a round of applause, if you don't mind. All right, so we're supposed to have 10 minutes each. I'm going to time myself, maybe touch on 10 points, so I don't go over 10 minutes. And then we can always expand during the Q&A. I think if I'm watching a film like this from a removed position, I would want to know how could something like this be happening in the 21st century. So then I would want to get some context. And I think the context is not very difficult to comprehend when we look at the historical role that the outside world has played in Africa. When we look at the history of colonial rule in Africa, British, the French were very prominent players, and the Belgians, of course. And then we had independence. The former European powers were fading economically, and the US sort of inherited the mantle and stepped into the vacuum. Particularly after 1957 with the Suez Crisis, when the British finally realized that their era as a global power had ended, when they were forced to retreat, when the US did not support the occupation of the Suez Canal. So the US assumed a dominant role, and we saw that played out in the Congo, where US interest becomes paramount, regardless of how the African ruler is treating his citizens. We saw the example in the Congo, Patrice Lumumba. Congo's possibility snuffed at independence. Lumumba overthrown only after 3 months, executed in the most brutal manner a few months later. Congo's hope, executed with US collaboration and involvement and Belgian collaboration and involvement. And Mobutu maintained for 37 years. And that was the Cold War era. So you're either with us or you're with the Soviet camp. If you're with us, you're fine. We don't care what you do to your country. Plunder, steal 5 billion. Destroy all the institutions. But you are our man. So then, at a later era, steps in a person like Yoweri Museveni, who learned everything that Mobutu had demonstrated. But in his case, he now uses a different narrative. He became the expert in playing the Islamic card. I won't go too much into detail because Dr. Helen Epstein is going to do an excellent job about that. It's in her book, which I strongly recommend, by the way, A Fine Mess, Another Fine Mess, because it documents the entire Museveni era and how he's been able to manipulate different successive US presidents. He's been in power for 32 years, since Ronald Reagan was president. Before many of my students who are here today were born, and perhaps some of us in the audience as well. Genius, brilliant in doing that. And the coin card was part of that narrative. Playing Joseph Kony, the LRA, as the existential threat to Uganda, and going along with willing foreign abettors, people who aided and abetted him. Not only the governments that maintained them, as was made very clear in the documentary, so I don't have to repeat that part of the narrative. But perhaps the part that is missing from the film, because the film covered a lot of ground, is the role of corporate media. How is it possible that a story like this could be hidden when the killing, the dying, was happening in plain view, in broad daylight? Those organizations that were delivering the food to those camps, they knew the conditions in those camps. The World Health Organization did a survey, issued a report in 2005 that found, as the Adam Branch, who's also in the film, said, there were 1,000 excess deaths per week. That means the death beyond the normal death rate. 1,000. So that translates into 52,000 per year. Those camps lasted for 20 years. So we're talking potentially more than 1 million people. And as I said in the film, had you chopped up 1 million people with a machete, obviously the consequence would be very different. We would know about it. You would no longer be able to pretend that this dictator you're dealing with in Uganda is all right, we can work with them. It would not be possible. So that's why I called it a brilliant genocide. It was done in a brilliant way by one of the most dangerous characters on the African continent today. He knows how to manipulate the West, the media, the governments, and the public. That is the role of the media, in going along with that narrative and not exposing you to these horrific crimes that were occurring in those camps in the northern part of Uganda. The story we all knew about was the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony. Most people here today know about Kony 2012. So once that became the dominant story, it's not possible to highlight any other story because that is the dominant narrative. When you have the US administration saying this is the story in Uganda, the gravest threat that people in Uganda face is from the Lord's Resistance Army. And we need to send troops to Uganda to help General Musavuli defeat this dangerous Lord's Resistance Army. And you know the media also, in fact, it's a good amount of what I deal with in my book. I deal with demonization of Africa and of Africans. It's always been part of the narrative. Historically, demonize Africans to justify colonial conquest and rule. Yes, they may look like human beings, but not quite the same as us at our level here in the West. So that was an important part of the narrative. It was a part of the narrative to justify U.S. relations or Western relations with Africa in the post-independence era. So for example, I have a chapter here where I deal with the guerrillas who were formed who were fighting against Mobutu when Mobutu was first installed in power. If you see the way they were characterized in Time magazine, for example, as people that cannot even articulate or speak. So, and you wonder, as they're writing this, demonizing the guerrillas, do they hope somehow that Western readers are going to have a negative stereotypical impression only of the guerrillas and not the people on Mobutu's side? I always wondered about that. And when we have the conflict, the conflagration in Rwanda, there's a section that I talk about in my book too, but I won't go into detail because we have an excellent presenter. We have two excellent presenters today on Rwanda. But there's a part where I discuss some of the articles in the New Yorker magazine where Hutus are blanket demonized and Tutsis are elevated deliberately with malicious intent to exacerbate ethnic tension even as the conflict is going on. So you have an article from the New Yorker magazine describing Tutsi as with aquiline noses, more European rather than African, and the Hutus are described as stocky, broad-nosed agriculturalists. You wonder, what is the intention of such writing? It can only be one purpose: to create the good guys and the bad guys. It has to be good and bad, black and white. And why do I bring up all this now? Because I want to tie it back into Uganda and Joseph Kony. So you have this demonic figure, this guy hiding in the jungle with dreadlocks, satanic almost, talking to the spirits. That's the characterization we get in many of the accounts of the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony. Who would not despise such a character? Do you need to know anything else that's going on? No, we have to eliminate that Joseph Kony. Meanwhile, what is going on? As we saw in the documentary, 1,000 excess deaths per week, 52,000 per year, perhaps 1 million. But, as we said back, who is the demon in Uganda? Is it Joseph Kony or Yoweri Museveni? I will let you be the judge. Let me close on this note. Museveni has been protected, not only for the crimes in Uganda, but in the Congo as well. Multiple invasions of the Congo led to the deaths of 7 million people. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal, June 8, 2006. It said the ICC was considering opening an investigation of Uganda's army's crimes in the Congo, which could have led to his indictment. Because in 2005, the International Court of Justice had already found Uganda liable for the war crimes and ordered it to pay Congo $10 billion. That article said Musavuli himself contacted Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the UN, and said, could you block this investigation? And Annan said, I don't have the power to do so. But guess what? Somebody had the power to do so because he was never indicted. He's not been indicted. And that's how he was able to commit more war crimes in southern Sudan when he invaded in December 2013. I close on that note. Thank you, sisters and brothers.
Thank you, Mr. Allimadi. Helen, in your text, you help us understand that Yoweri Museveni has many tentacles, that he's someone who's managed to destabilize not only his own country, northern Uganda, but that his prowess, if you will, has extended into the broader region, and he has helped to destabilize that broader privileged region. So I wonder if you could talk about the role he's played in the broader geopolitics of the region.
Yes, thank you very much. Is this one? Great.
Is it on?
Closer.
Is it on? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah? Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming. It's really heartening to see you all here, and for this very rather painful discussion. I thought I'd start with a little bit about myself, actually. I used to be a biologist, as Tiffany mentioned. I haven't picked up a pipette in a long time. But 25 years ago, I actually went to Uganda for the first time. I was working for a company that was trying to make an AIDS vaccine. As you all know, our project failed. There is still no AIDS vaccine, in fact. But I was fascinated by the country, by Uganda and its struggles. At the time, the story, which my expatriate friends and I all subscribed to, this was about 1993, when many of the events in the film were taking place, by the way. At the time, the story, we were all in the South, though, so we really didn't know much about what was going on. And the story we heard was that Uganda was a poor nation emerging from decades of political turmoil, and its leader, Yoweri Museveni, who had taken power by the gun, admittedly, seemed committed to development. The poverty rate, we were told, was falling. The president was frank about AIDS, and he was making fledgling steps towards democracy. And this is what most people still know about Yoweri Museveni. We knew at the time even that political opposition activities were banned, that journalists were being arrested, that there was a mysterious rebel insurgency led by this warlord named Joseph Kony in the north of the country. But we all thought these were just hiccups in a generally positive African story. There was a theory back then that developing countries do better under dictatorships because they don't have to deal with the horse trading complexities of democratic politics. And I sort of entertained this idea myself at first, but then I began to realize that strongman rule just really wasn't working in Uganda. I keep an eye on health statistics, because of my background, I guess, and also because I think they indicate deeper signs of trouble. Uganda actually performs poorly on just about every measure of development compared to other countries in the region that get similar amounts of foreign aid, like Ethiopia, Kenya, and even Rwanda. This is whether we're talking about poverty rates, childhood vaccinations, malaria deaths, primary school enrollment, safe water, and so on. Uganda is the bottom of their list. Except for countries like South Sudan and Congo, they're at war. And this is despite, actually by now, about $30 billion in donor investment in development since Museveni took power, most of which came from US taxpayers. There's a very simple answer. So the question that this automatically raises is, where has all this money gone? Well, there's a very simple answer to that. Billions of dollars in government funds have disappeared into the coffers of Museveni and his henchmen, including donor funds intended for AIDS and malaria victims and for children's vaccines, reconstruction of the war-torn North, refugees and other humanitarian projects. But Museveni's Uganda continues to receive about $1 billion in development funds from the US. Around the time the Kony 2012 video was made, the Congress approved about $300 million in military aid for Uganda. And while some of the humanitarian is well spent, much of it ends up in Uganda's budget, where it's very vulnerable to misuse and blatant theft. So for years I tried to understand why our tax dollars kept flowing into Museveni's defense budget in particular. The roots of this conundrum turned out to be decades old and very deep. Museveni came to power in 1986, 3 years before the Berlin Wall fell. The Soviets were on the way out of Africa by then, but a new threat loomed, which we now know as militant Islam. And it was gaining strength, especially in Sudan. Uganda's northern neighbor. Sudan had been an ally of the West in the 1970s and early 80s, but in 1989 it was taken over by radical Islamists and began welcoming sort of scary people such as Osama bin Laden and members of Islamic Jihad, which was bent on toppling our ally in Egypt, which is above Sudan, and undoing Egypt's peace deal with Israel, which Washington wanted very much to preserve. Most worrying of all, in the early 1990s, Sudan's Islamist leaders began forming an alliance with Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, which is now known as Congo, which just happens to be home to $24 trillion worth of unexploited precious natural resources, including oil, gold, diamonds, coltan for your cell phone, cobalt and nickel and jet engines and car batteries, uranium and bombs, the iron and everything, and so on. The growing alliance between Mobutu and in Zaire and the Sudanese leaders raised the frightening possibility that Congo's wealth might fall into the Islamist sphere of influence. Back then, Museveni must have seemed like a ray of hope for Washington. He offered to help stabilize this precarious situation. In fact, what he actually did was the exact opposite. Around 1991 or two, as Milton actually helped discover, Museveni began funneling weapons to rebels fighting the Islamists in Sudan. They were called the SPLA. They now run South Sudan. The leaders of Sudan got wind of what Uganda was doing and began supporting various Ugandan rebel groups, including Joseph Kony. Scholars and journalists have noted that on many occasions, Museveni seemed to miss potential openings for peace in northern Uganda. When Kony offered to surrender to one of Museveni's generals, Museveni ordered his release, according to that general. When one of Museveni's cabinet ministers organized peace talks, Museveni sabotaged them by threatening to crush them. When Catholic leaders tried to revive the peace talks, Museveni's soldiers attacked them. This went on for some 2 decades. Meanwhile, Museveni was also helping to create pandemonium in Rwanda. In 1990, he backed the Rwandan Patriotic Front invasion of Rwanda from Uganda. The Rwandan Patriotic Front occupied northern Rwanda for 3.5 years, during which time it committed many atrocities against the Rwandan Hutu people. These atrocities, which evoked almost no criticism from the international community, helped set the stage for the 1994 genocide against the Tutsis, which you'll hear more about from Judi and Claude. After the Rwandan rebels took power, they, along with the Ugandan army, invaded Zaire, setting off cycles of violence in that country that have since claimed millions more lives and continue to roil Congo to this day. Despite this record, Museveni receives a constant stream of praise in international circles. In the 1990s, Time magazine hailed him as a herdsman philosopher, and the New York Times even suggested that he might turn out to be another Nelson Mandela. In June 1994, with the Rwanda genocide at its height, the University of Minnesota gave Museveni an honorary degree for diplomacy. Today, he's praised by the UN as a champion of refugees. even though many, if not most, of the Congolese and South Sudanese now seeking refuge in Uganda were driven from their homes by the action of the 70's own army or its proxy forces. And as if this were not dispiriting enough, the anti-corruption group Transparency International just last week gave Museveni a prize for fighting graft. Anyway, many brave Ugandans, both within the country and outside, are trying to fight back. About a year ago, a new movement emerged to try to stop Museveni from changing Uganda's constitution so he could rule essentially forever. Two independent surveys showed that 80% of Ugandans oppose this, and a group of courageous members of parliament, including the famous Afro-pop musician Bobby Wine, tried to filibuster the change. But Museveni's special forces invaded parliament and violently arrested them. The operatives were wearing business suits. Some were even men dressed up as women in skirts. So when footage of the brawl was shown on the news around the world, it looked like the MPs were fighting amongst themselves. But in fact, it was a blatant, illegal attack on democracy. One member of parliament named Betty Namboze was dragged off the floor of the House to an area without security cameras and tortured so badly her spine was broken in 3 places and she had to endure a 6-hour operation so she could walk again. And she's not alone. Many other politicians and opposition activists have been detained and beaten in illegal detention centers and even killed. These people need our help. Despite everything, we still have some rights in this country, and so I urge you all to join the struggle to end U.S. non-humanitarian support to Museveni's regime. As long as he's in power, there's scant hope for peace anywhere in the Horn and Great Lakes of Africa. The world is in a very confused moral state at the moment, and it has therefore never been more important to do the right thing. Thank you so much for listening.
Judi, we really are grateful to have you here this evening. I hope your journey wasn't too long. I wonder, the account that you write is so well researched, so well put together, and I know that I mentioned in the beginning that many journalists put their lives on the line to do the work that they do, and that's what makes it all the more amazing to actually have these first-hand accounts. In Praise of Bud, it was by Terry Gold said that it should be compulsory reading for a world that isn't acknowledged only half the story of the Rwandan genocide. As I mentioned in the beginning, you can go anywhere, any corner of the earth, and I think most people are familiar with the Rwandan genocide. But many people do not know the other part of that story. So I wonder if you could speak to that, but I wonder also, specifically if you could talk about essentially the methods used by the RPF to conceal the crimes that they committed and the atrocities. This has really gone largely untold. I think when we talk about exposés, if you look up expose in the dictionary, this should be the definition next to it, the crimes of the RPF, because it's something that the regime has done an excellent job at concealing. And I didn't mention this earlier, but I think one thing we should understand about Paul Kagame is that he has an excellent PR campaign. I had my students last week do a Google search of Rwanda just to see what comes up if you throw Rwanda into a Google search engine, and you see all sorts of accounts of development and more women in parliament than any country probably on earth, and all of these wonderful accolades about all that Kagame has achieved. Nowhere do you see anything about Kagame's involvement in the Rwandan genocide. So if you can tell us a bit more about your research and what you discovered.
Thank you, Tiffany. You're right, the propaganda campaign has been very effective. Milton was talking a bit about propaganda and how successful it's been in the mainstream media. I've been examining crimes committed by the Rwandan Patriotic Front under Paul Kagame for about 20 years now. And I keep coming back to the notions of power and truth. I grapple with these things. I ask myself rhetorical questions that have led me to draw some unsettling conclusions about how the world operates and who loses in that high stakes game. Congo was the prison through which I first began to question the RPF narrative, the Rwandan Patriotic Front narrative, and I started to reevaluate my worldview. I became involved in issues in the Great Lakes region in 1997, a few days after Mobutu Sese Seko was toppled. I went into Congo, as it was renamed, shortly thereafter. I saw firsthand, in fairly short order, that Rwanda had completely occupied the country by that time. The cities, the villages, and even strategic areas of the forest. I realized over the course of a number of weeks that there had been a Western-backed regime change in that country. And I say that because the US, principally through satellite technology and communication, and various forms of military and political assistance, ultimately bolstered the Rwandan effort to oust Mobutu. So specifically, I was interested in the Rwandan, in the humanitarian crisis. And what I did fairly quickly was to go into the jungle with local volunteers from Doctors Without Borders, UNHCR, and the Red Cross. And what we were doing was going on search and rescue missions in the jungle. And we were looking for Rwandan Hutu refugees who had survived attacks by Kagame's army. And we found many of them, and those who were able to lucidly tell their stories did, and they explained that essentially their families had been attacked in these camps by soldiers speaking Kinyarwanda who unleashed gunfire, and many people died, many people were too weak to move, and those who could scattered further in the jungle. But most of the people I saw in the forest were in fact in such a state of breakdown that many were catatonic looking. There were children, women who couldn't speak. They were suffering from various diseases, infection, chronic hunger, and they were completely broken. So actually still have photographs too from mass graves that were covered, and these were just sunken pieces, sunken areas of the ground, and I've had those looked at by forensic anthropologists. But we know a lot of this story, and it was horrifying to see, but what I got a glimpse of fairly quickly was signs of something as disturbing or something that I had not prepared to understand at all. And that was what had happened a few years prior. I kept asking Rwandan Hutu refugees why they fled to Zaire in the first place and why they stayed. It seems strange to me that more than 1 million people were still in those camps, living in squalor to begin with, and then became targets. If the narrative was to be believed that Paul Kagame had stopped the genocide. So I couldn't get my head around the fact that Kagame, who had stopped the genocide and was supposedly a leader of an African Renaissance, had killed all these people, ordered his troops to kill in Congo, and yet a few years earlier had been a brilliant leader that saved all these Tutsis. So I kept asking these questions, and they admitted to me that, in fact, they fled to Zaire because their families were being killed. They fled war, and their families were being killed by the RPF. and they were afraid to go home. And I asked them why they were afraid to go home now if it was peaceful, and they said that a lot of people who were returning were disappearing. So this was very troubling to me because I had absorbed so much propaganda, but I assimilated it anyhow, and when I left Congo and went to Rwanda, I met people there, and there was one Hutu intellectual, someone who was quite educated, who was in a transit camp, and he was so irretrievably broken and tormented, very ragged and sick, and he told me his story about losing his family in Zaire, a young baby and his wife in front of his eyes. Again, same story. Kinyarwanda-speaking troops went in and killed his family. But he told me it was his second family. His first family had been murdered during the genocide, and I asked him to talk to me about that. Of course, we were in a transit camp that was occupied, where Tutsi Rwandan Patriotic Front soldiers were stationed, and they were roaming around and listening to my interviews. So he was trying to whisper to me. I shut my microphone off, and we tried to talk as privately as we could. And he said to me that the Interahamwe did not kill his, these were Hutu militia, they did not kill his family. Former Hutu military forces did not kill his family. I said, who killed your family then? And he would not tell me, but then he looked me in the eye and said, I want you to know that everyone hears that there's one category of victim in Rwanda, and there's one category of executioner, and that is not true. There was violence on both sides. And he looked at the soldiers, and he looked at me, and then I understood. And it was one of many epiphanies in the interviews that I did, but it shattered I finally believed what he said. He was so, his story was credible. And here I just want to say that the lack of independently conducted interviews with Rwandan Hutu refugees in Central Africa, of people who fled Rwanda after the genocide, and then the Tutsis who fled Kagame's regime. The lack of empirical studies has been a colossal failure on the part of academics, the United Nations, NGOs, journalists, all of us. And this has impeded our understanding of the dynamics of violence. So over the years, I've interviewed hundreds of victims, direct and contextual. I've interviewed people at the UN tribunal that was set up to look into the violence of the genocide. I've also interviewed former soldiers and officers of Kagame's army. So I wanted to understand the violence, how Kagame got away with it, but what it looked like. And what I discovered was the RPF used a variety of methods to kill and cover up their tracks. They began killing Hutus with zeal and organization in the north, in the northern region called Buyumba, which they in fact occupied already during the invasion war before the genocide. And so the massacres against the Hutu population in northern Rwanda were not retaliatory. We often hear this, that whatever violence Kagame waged during the genocide, it's retaliatory. It was not. This was preemptive. And so quickly, in the hours after the plane was shot down, after the Hutu president was assassinated, Habyarimana, they started to massacre quickly, and they moved down very quickly the eastern side of the country and organized mobile death squads where they slaughtered Hutus in the fields, in their homes, and they organized and invited Hutus to meetings by promising them food and other supplies. They would kill them at these meetings, and they often left the victims there. Many people who would come in and inspect the area, if there were any people, would assume that these were Tutsis who had been killed by Hutu forces. The other major way in which Paul Kagame's forces killed people was to simply invite them to the locations, put them on trucks, and bring them to Akagera Park and Gabiro, which is a military barracks in the park, in the eastern part of the country. And so these were ways that Kagame's RPA could kill, and kill in a hidden way that people didn't know about. So what was happening is a lot of the people that were put on these trucks were brought to the park, killed there, and their bodies were burned and incinerated. So I'm going a little bit long, but those were some of the tactics. And so what we had was the burning of corpses and fires that went on for several weeks. The United Nations became aware of those crimes, and investigators interviewed many survivors. Eventually, by the end of 2003, a team of investigators under Carla Del Ponte, who was the chief prosecutor, they recruited 100 sources and collected 41 very detailed statements from these witnesses, mostly from former officers and soldiers of his army. And this report, a summary report of this, listed massacre sites across the country. So a lot of the witness reports are detailed, the summary report less detailed, but it describes harrowing crimes. And one of the discoveries I made and did many more interviews on was how his military intelligence established commandos and something called technicians. These were groups of young men who worked in military intelligence, who infiltrated Hutu militias and killed Tutsis as well. So some of the Tutsis that were killed at roadblocks in Kigali and across the country were in fact killed by Kagame's own forces. So what we saw was enough prima facie evidence to indict the senior commanders of the Rwanda Patriotic Front and possibly Kagame himself. And one of the reports lists targets for indictments, but these indictments were never issued. Why? Because the United States intervened at the tribunal. The U.S. ambassador for war crimes, named Pierre Prosper, in 2003, negotiated a deal with the Rwandan government to share evidence with the Rwandan government and investigate the crimes that the team of investigators had collected evidence on. So can you imagine, this was a deal which was frankly illegal, but that gave the authority to investigate crimes to the killers themselves. So that deal that was negotiated by the United States was de facto applied, because at the same time that this negotiation was going on, Del Ponte, the Italian magistrate who wanted to indict several members of the RPF, and she issued a warning that indictments were coming down the pipeline. She was removed, and a more easygoing and obedient prosecutor was appointed. So those are just some of the ways that crimes have been concealed, and I know I'm going over, but there's just a few other things that I wanted to point out. At the height of the genocide, the United Nations knew that Kagame was committing crimes. There was a UN protection cable that talked about Hutu displaced Hutu refugees being slaughtered, their bodies in the east of the country being dumped in the Kagera River. It's a fairly detailed cable. That was in May 1994. That was buried. There were no further investigations on the shooting, stabbing, and burning of refugees in the East in May. In 1994, we had in September a report by Robert Gersony, who did investigations in 1/3 of Rwanda's communes, in 1/3 of the country. He said that the RPF committed organized massacres that constituted genocide. That report that was tabled to the United Nations was buried. There was early evidence that Kagame's commandos had shot down the plane, and the prosecutor at the time, Louise Arbour, Canadian, she shut down that probe and said she didn't have the mandate to investigate it, when in fact the statute of the United Nations Tribunal said she could investigate terrorism. There were other investigations and findings amongst themselves. The Rwandan Hutu refugees conducted their own probes and came up with a list of 20,000 victims who had been killed prior to the genocide and in the first few months, and that was tabled to the United Nations, and it was not acted upon, it was disregarded. We had I have a lot of these lists of victims, it's just list after list. Then there was another probe of 18,000 people, their names written in on paper, of people who were killed in Gitarama in June 1994. That was sent to the tribunal, that was disregarded. So we've had some of the discussions already from Helen and Milton about the geopolitical interests that have supported Kagame, that wanted to open up the Great Lakes region to valuable strategic minerals and possibly find proxies to fight their wars on terror. I don't have to tell you why. I have a few other ideas that maybe I can discuss later, but I want to give Claude the microphone.
Thank you so much. And I just want to lift what you said about, the fact that these atrocities really have not been well documented, well researched, and I think that's why the personal testimony of people like Claude is so critically important. Claude, I wonder, I'm sure that as a survivor of such an atrocity, even attending these kinds of events where you recount your personal testimony is re-traumatizing in a certain way. And I want to let you know that we appreciate you being here tonight to deliver that personal testimony on behalf of all of those who are not present. If you would like to share, and also to talk about the ways in which, as you see it, the American taxpayer is complicit and what we can do about it.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here with you guys. Just wanted to start with
Turn yours off.
Face together.
They are too close. Yes.
I think this is a lot better.
Going down.
Okay. I think we're good to go now.
Try not to cross far as possible. Give Claude Judi's mic. Just stop.
Want me to turn it off?
Okay, go ahead.
Why don't you use this one?
Yeah, just get that.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here and to be able to share not only my personal testimony, but also share what does this have to do with us, everybody here in the room, the American public, and what can we do? What have we done in the past that's worked, and what can we do to help the situation. The first thing I want to start with is I'd like to just say hello to some of my friends that are in the audience and both in the room and also on the live streaming. I want to start on a lighter note. So I'll tell a little bit of my story because I think it's important. So we watched a film, we've read books, we've heard from witnesses and authors, but you know, hearing the story from somebody that's actually survived it, for me, I just want to put a human face to what we are discussing. That this happens to somebody, this is somebody that's lived it, that you can actually shake hands with, that you can see, that you can talk to. It happens to real people. It doesn't happen on movies and books. It's not staged. It's not just on screen or on paper. So I was born in Rwanda, and I was born in Rwanda, and I grew up thinking that there was only one country in the world. You know anybody else like that? And I thought that every person was Rwandan. So I thought, you know, Michael Jackson was Rwandan, Muhammad Ali was Rwandan, Bob Marley was Rwandan, everybody. And there were white people that came from Europe, but I thought Europe was some part of Rwanda where the people didn't speak Rwanda very well. You know, spoke with a really funny accent and looked funny. And then when I was about 10 years old, a war started. And it said that this war started from Uganda. It's like, what is Uganda? And they said it's another country. It's like, there's only one. No, there is other countries. And the invading army was a Tutsi army, which is one of the ethnic groups in Rwanda. And I didn't know anything about ethnicity. I remember one day they asked us in school what ethnic groups we belonged to. And some people knew they were Hutus, others knew they were Tutsis. The majority didn't know what they were. And then, you know, when they asked me, I got up and I was really proud. You know, I was like, I'm a Christian. And that's the reaction that I got. And then I went home and I told my parents, and this, you know, I was like, is there something wrong with being a Christian? And my parents said, what are you talking about? So I told them the story. And my sister, who is a year younger than me, goes, oh, Claude, you are so stupid. You should have told me Catholic. So that's to the extent that I was oblivious to not only the world around me, but also the issues of ethnicity in Rwanda. So the war starts, and the country just, you know, starts degenerating. Over 4 years, almost 4 years, this war lasted. Started seeing refugees. There were people fleeing the war from the northern part of the country who were homeless, and they were living in horrible conditions to where, when you think about it, there's no sense in a person leaving their home to live in the conditions that they were living in. And they had all kinds of horrible stories to tell of the atrocities that Judi talked about. People getting killed with, you know, hoes, and, you know, people getting buried alive, and people getting called to meetings and getting killed. All those stories. And I was a kid, but, you know, to some extent I was like, you know, I don't know if this is real. And then it got real in '94, because I lived in Kigali, which was, the war had not touched Kigali until April 6, 1994, when the president's plane was shot. And then that same night, I started hearing all these explosions, bombings everywhere, you know, and then in the next days, people were screaming and crying for help. And then these militias, the extremist Hutu militias, started going house to house hunting for Tutsis. At the time, my father was not in Rwanda when the whole genocide broke out. And we fled our home. We ended up getting smuggled out of our home, and we stayed with another family that protected us. And during that time, there were so many people killed. There were so many bodies piled on the side of the street. And I want to make sure that everyone understands. Although I'm talking about these atrocities committed by Africans, Africans are not savages. We are not violent people. These are things that are done by the extremist elements of society in both ethnic groups, by the way, because the crimes that the RPF committed, which was a Tutsi army, were just as horrible. So we flee our home, and at some point, my mother and I were both captured, and we were ordered to dig our own grave because they were going to chop us to death and kill us. We ended up fleeing the country. And the whole time, we had, from one place to the next place, somebody either intervening, strangers, people that we didn't know, or people that we knew who were sheltering us, all the way to the Congo. And when we crossed the border, we crossed with over 1 million people who were fleeing the RPF, who was basically shelling and shooting everybody indiscriminately. I mean, women were running with, dead babies on their backs and things like that. Then we were rescued out of the Congo by an American aid worker, and finally we made our way to the US after about a year and a half after the genocide. So I'll talk about this, but I just want everybody to know these atrocities didn't stop. What happened 2 years later, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Paul Kagame, and Museveni's military invaded the Congo, went into those refugee camps, slaughtered the people in those refugee camps, women, children, the blind, the handicapped, all kinds of people. And Judi talked about some of that. And then they pursued them all the way across the Congo. The Congo is the size of the U.S. east of the Mississippi. So that's a whole bunch of states, I think about 20 or more. Or the size of Western Europe. They pursued them all the way across the country. They took over the Congo, and they installed Rwandan soldiers in the Congolese government. The former Rwandan defense minister, General James Kabarebe, was a military chief of staff in Congo. He started in Uganda as a soldier in Uganda. Then they invaded Rwanda, took over. He was part of the group that assassinated the president, according to a lot of the documents and documentaries that have come out. Then invaded the Congo, and he became a military chief of staff. So my brother Kambale, whom I believe you're going to hear from later, calls these guys criminals without borders. So we have doctors without borders, and we have criminals without borders. So then, as they pursued these refugees, the media never reported on it. There was no real shining light on these atrocities. And then over time, for me, I kept looking at not only what happened in the genocide in Rwanda, and what happened to the refugees that went into the Congo, but the Congolese themselves. 6 million people died in the Congo because of the invasion of Rwanda and Uganda. Again, led by the extremist elements. This is not a general African thing. I want to make sure of that. And I kept thinking, why is this happening? But I didn't care. I wanted to live a quote-unquote normal life. And I wanted to forget about it, leave it behind me, leave all the memories and but I couldn't escape the nightmares from all of those people, that I had seen get killed, and all of the atrocities that I had witnessed. So, and I also couldn't, my own wounds, because, I do have wounds on my body from, those times. So, I read the book of Frederick Douglass. I think most of you, I believe you've heard of him. He was a 7-year-old sold into slavery and freed himself at 21. After reading that book, I felt useless. I felt like, I need to do something, because this guy had nothing, to begin with. And I was sitting in the library. I was about the same age that he was when he escaped slavery and helped so many other people. And I decided, I'm gonna start engaging in what's happening in the Congo and what's happening to other children like me at the time when the genocide happened. So the more and more I got involved, the more I realized this isn't just something that is totally African. So that's where I want to talk about what does this have to do with us. The US is a donor to the government of Rwanda, the government of Uganda, and the current government of Congo that are all committing atrocities against Africans. Millions of Africans have been killed by other Africans, which to me I equate to when slavery was happening, what we have right now with Museveni, Kagame, and Kabila in the region is the same as the Africans who sold other Africans into slavery for profit. And they're profiteering because they're looting the Congo, they're enriching themselves and their families and their friends, and also killing a bunch of Africans. And the world pretends not to care, but there are multinationals that are making profit off of this. And we have, we actually as citizens, as tax-paying citizens, and that's one of the things that really bothers me, because when I pay taxes and I know that my taxes are going to support these dictators, you know, to me it's like I'm sponsoring, you know, and I'm paying not only the salaries but these guys to go and get weapons and go and kill my people. And I think that's wrong, and I think, I hope that every one of you in the audience can have some sympathy and get engaged in stopping the US government from supporting these dictators. There will be some call to actions and you can stay engaged. But that's one thing that I wanted to talk about. The other thing is that the repression hasn't stopped. If you have not heard, look up these two women in Rwanda, one named Victoire Ingabire and another named Diane Rwigara. They both tried to run against Kagame. He's won elections 3 times, won. He assigned himself over 90% of the votes at every one of those elections. 93% the first time, he was not satisfied, he got 95% the second time, and this last time he gave himself almost 99%. Diane and her family were arrested and kept in jail for over a year. Just for the simple crime of running. So this narrative of women in government, knowing that the 2 women who have run against him, that actually had a legitimate, that posed a legitimate challenge, have been in prison, and Victoire served 8 years, is a false narrative. So just hold your government accountable in terms of pushing to stop especially military support to these dictators. I want to just end by sharing a few victories that we've seen, why this works. In 2012, there was a militia in the Congo known as the M23. The M23 was sponsored, trained, and provided logistical training by Rwandan president's aides, generals, General James Kabarebe that I mentioned earlier, General Charles Kayonga, General Jack Nziza were all named in a UN report. The UN has released so many reports, has gathered so many reports, and refused to release those reports because of pressure from either the U.S. or the Rwandan government, and it takes an organized effort. When the M23 was committing all these atrocities in the Congo, we organized. We organized call-ins, we organized protests at the UN, and we got with the media and put so much pressure on them. We pressured, especially the U.S. ambassador to the UN was Susan Rice. They finally released the report. When they released the report, the U.S. was compelled to stop aid to Rwanda. It was peanuts. They only withheld $200,000. That's a salary for somebody, one person. But it had a domino effect that other donor nations followed suit, and millions of dollars were withheld from the Rwandan government and not a month after, the M23 dissolved. So this works, and I just ask you all to make sure that you hold your government accountable and stop the support to these dictators in Africa that are killing millions of Africans for the benefit of multinationals supported by Western governments, including the US, the UK, the French, and others. Thank you so much.
No, I think, sorry. Claude, thank you for that. You know, as I said, it's important to have the testimony of people who have been as close to these atrocities as people like Claude. We have one additional speaker, and while we're connecting to him via, I think it's Skype or video conference, I'll introduce him. But before I do, I just want to quickly give a plug to the call for action, and I think everyone should have a program. There are programs placed on each of your seats. You might be wondering what it is you can do. And so I would ask you to take a look at your program and note the call for action. So I think we have Kambale on the line. I'll go ahead and introduce him, and then we'll follow with the call to action. Kambale Musavuli, a native of the DRC, is a student coordinator and national spokesperson for the Friends of the Congo. His professional activities, publications, and public engagements reflect his commitment, his unwavering commitment to realizing peace and justice in the Congo. We're so glad to have him on via Skype. Kambale, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. I wonder if you can speak a bit about the work of the Friends of Congo, in particular the work of the youth movement, and maybe just touch on the recent elections. We have maybe about 7 minutes for you, but if you can just comment on them briefly.
I'll try to do it in 5. So first, apologies, I'm not with you in person, but thanks to the Congo and its minerals, I'm able to connect with you remotely. I would like to definitely thank all the panelists. For those who are in the audience, you may not realize how dangerous this work is. Many people have made personal sacrifices. So each panelist that you have at the moment there with you have suffered tremendous pressure from government in the region because they decided to speak the truth. And this is very important, especially when atrocities are taking place and you hear the numbers. Watching Brilliant Genocide for the first time made it clear to me that the liberation of the Congo is not going to be fully realized until the people of Rwanda and Uganda as well are liberated. It's the second force affecting all of that, from Musavuli causing havoc. And when you talk to the victims of the region, they all have similar stories. They're butchered by machetes, buried alive. The women are the ones who face the brunt of this conflict, with using rape as a weapon of war all across the region. But in the situation in the Congo, you know, I'm sure it's been already mentioned, over 6 million Congolese have died. And I'm seeing a few people in the audience as I speak. I still do not see a rally yet when I say over 6 million people have died in the Congo. Imagine to hear the sheer number of people dead, and yet there is still no action, concrete action to end this modern-day genocide. And as it took place, it was an invasion of Rwanda and Uganda, two of U.S. staunchest allies on the African continent. The U.S., over the years, had done everything in their power to protect their allies, continuing to use them in U.S. military operation, be it in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Mali, in Central African Republic, and even in Haiti. You find soldiers from these countries. What I've seen over the years is the more crimes they commit, the more reward they get from Washington. And that can only end with citizens of these countries speaking up, saying that I cannot pay my tax money to continue to fund criminal activities around the world. But why the Congo? Why are they invading the Congo and millions of people are dying? I mean, Congo is central to modern technology, as I mentioned a moment ago. Congo's wealth is estimated at $24 trillion. It has every known mineral to man, from coltan to cobalt, where right now, for you New Yorkers, you should know that Rudy Giuliani is lavishing and is so ready to benefit from Congo's minerals when New Yorkers don't even know. This comes from an article that was published this week on the New York Times, explaining how a lobby group in Washington, D.C., hired by an Israeli firm, Mer Securities, that they have the office in Tel Aviv, have been paying lobbyists in Washington to protect the regime of Kambale in Kinshasa in the Congo. And what took place in July was Rudy Giuliani and different Republicans sat down with investors discussing Congo's cobalt while we Congolese are mobilizing around elections. And what does that actually mean even long term? This is just a pattern whereby since 2001, when Kabila, the son, became the president of the Congo with the support of the United States has been at the side, always on the wrong side of history when it comes to the Congo. In 2006, while Congolese took it to the streets during the elections, they were actually, the United States supported the result of 2006. The same thing happened in 2011. But since 2011, the Congolese people have been resisting. And I have to put a particular note on the youth, because it's very important, as we've talked about the atrocities, talked about the pilfering of Congo's resources. But you may read the newspaper and you hear around the electoral process, the protests happening inside of the Congo. But what the analysis will not provide is the courage of the Congolese. If it wasn't from the Congolese youth, you will not be talking about the electoral process in the Congo. In 2015, they took it to the streets, shut down a city of 15 million people, but they paid a huge price. At least 400 young Congolese were killed during that time. And over the period from 2015 to today, the young Congolese have been at the forefront of putting pressure on a US-backed dictator, Kabila. Don't get it twisted. Even though he appears that the US may be putting pressure on Kabila, they do support him. These young people have been jailed. Some have been killed, like the name of Rossi Mukendi, Teres Kapangala, and many others have lost their lives in this fight. But they give me courage. They give me courage that they've put their lives on the line to see a better Congo. They may not know what's happening in Washington and London, but they know that they are in a land that's very blessed, whereby if Congo is liberated, it will transform the African continent. And that gives us, me, my colleagues, friends at the Congo, and the panelists and everyone in the room, the courage to say the least we can do is bring the story to you. You are in New York, you are in the United States, you have heard the story of a genocide happening in Uganda, happening in Rwanda, happening in the Congo, while the world remains silent. What can you do? And I've already said it's very clear. Congo and the region does not need charity, they need justice. Dr. Mukwege, who's just won the Nobel Peace Prize, in his speech, he made a remarkable speech as he was receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. He says something very important that many people do not even hear or understand. He called on the world to finally implement the recommendation of the UN Mapping Exercise report, a critical report when it comes to genocide in Congo. That report was published documenting crimes that had been committed in the Congo from 1993 to 2003. And they documented the most atrocious or egregious violation of human rights and humanitarian law. Here's the context. You kill 10 people in a village, it's not making it into that report. You bury 200 people alive, it makes it to that report. That just gives you a sense of the seriousness of the report. And it only documented 617 incidents of crimes committed. And Judi has mentioned in the presentation also what happened to Hutu refugees. But in that report, it clearly stated that what's happening in the Congo is war crimes, crimes against humanity, and possible genocide if proven in a competent court. It proposed steps to actually hold perpetrators of violence accountable. Dr. Mukwege and many people who look at the situation in the Congo, and including myself, we believe that until the perpetrator of the violence are held accountable, are brought to justice, we will continue to have the violence that we see in the region. So that will be my call for Americans who are in the room, to make sure that justice is delivered for the many Africans in the Great Lakes region, to support the implementation of the recommendation of the UN Mapping Exercise report, and to demand that our government not take our tax money to cause wars, to support dictators in Africa or anywhere else around the world. I think I will stop there and look forward to the discussion and engagement that we have to have.
Thank you so much. We're really glad to have you. So in the interest of time, it's about 9 o'clock and we want to begin the Q&A session. So I want to spend a moment just to draw our attention back to the call to action that I mentioned earlier, I referenced earlier. If you look at the back of your program, right, and thank you, Kambale, for just giving us another one. But there are a few other things that we can do. There are a number of existing petitions circulating the internet. One that we want you to visit immediately if you can is located on the blackallianceforpeace.com, and that's to abolish AFRICOM. You all are familiar, or many of us should be familiar with the, I think, 60-plus military bases across the continent. AFRICOM is really no friend to Africa, let's say. Number 2, sign up to volunteer, spread the word. Sign petitions, write letters, make phone calls, set up screenings, or speaking engagements. Our esteemed panel, I'm sure, will be more than happy and willing to come and accommodate you. Make a financial contribution to support the work of organizing events such as this evening. And I think if we can just take a moment and give a round of applause to our organizers. It's really an honor to be here. I just want to take a moment before we get to the Q&A and highlight something that Kambale said and his message about the youth. I think if we look back in history, whether it's the recent history of the last 100 years or prior to that, we know that youth have been really instrumental, integral, in fact, to social change, whether it was the civil rights movement in the United States in the 60s, whether it was the fight for decolonization and independence and liberation struggles across the continent, even in countries like, let's say continents rather, hemispheres like South America, Central America. These efforts have always been driven by our youth, and I think it's important that we recognize that and continue to encourage that. I believe it was Kwame Nkrumah at his independence speech that mentioned the line that Kambale mentioned, that the total liberation of the continent is linked up with that of any one nation on the continent. And until we have complete liberation, political, economic, social, full liberation of these countries, we will not see the power placed into the hands of the people. I think we can start with the Q&A now. I had a few questions for the panelists that maybe we'll come to, but let's move into the audience questions. I'm sure you all have some riveting questions that you're waiting to come and ask. So I will come around with a microphone, and as you can, I would say just come to the center of the room.
Black man.
Thank you. I just want to thank the panelists and
The mic.
everybody for coming here to say, to give full details of what is going on in different parts of Africa. There's a saying in Africa, a proverb that says, until the lion produces his own historian, the story of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So it's time for Africans to start talking, create your own media. We cannot depend on those who are plunging on the continent, who want every part. I wish we don't have resources, because a country that has no resources have peace. So as long as they need our resources, there will be less peace. And I'm so happy that this conversation continues to take place, and for you, young man, as well as everybody else, taking initiative in doing what they have to do. So I just want to find out, how can we create our own media, just like they have in Al Jazeera, that will be so powerful to expose all these issues? And also another point is about education. We have many intellectuals, Africans, so-called intellectuals. Like I said, if they have so much PhD holders in Nigeria, if you put them on the top of the Olumo Rock, it will sink it. But when you have so much educators, what do you talk about gathering yourself together? How do we educate Africans? How do we change the curriculum? So that's the question that I want to throw out there. How can we get a lot of our so-called intellectuals to come together and start writing curriculum? Because when you don't teach about history, it's bound to repeat itself. Because I'm so tired of listening to the genocide of the continent. I just finished reading this book, written by a Nigerian American, called A Moonless Starless Sky, that she talked about so many different places. She spent about 6 years in Uganda to talk about people who are fighting cold. She went to Mauritania, she went to Nigeria, or into all these places to talk about people who are actually ignoring their government and doing what they have to do to make changes. So those are my two questions that I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can take maybe one more. Let's do a couple at a time.
Short. A short one.
A short one. Okay. And then
It's a comment to Claude and to the Skype gentleman. I would like you to read a book. I'm a literary genealogist. Read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Do you know what the number, I think it's the 16th protocol is? Give them all the money they want to continue the wars and keep them on leash. That's in the book.
What's the name of the book?
The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And also, you mentioned something about Zika. Do you know that Zika, Ebola, and AIDS all have patent numbers? Oh, that means it's made right here.
thank you. One more.
Lisa is my name, and I prefer to call myself Pan-African because I have a heart for Africa.
The mic.
Yeah, I have a heart for Africa. What the sister has just said is right. We need to create our own platform and tell the truth and not rely on people who come in, get half-baked information and feed it on the people who are around. You're making it look like where people are from, things are really bad. I will first of all thank
Milton.
Milton Allimadi. I don't know whether you could be a son of Mzee Tema or Tema Allimadi.
Absolutely.
He was a fine man, and I don't think he would have to go to let things happen the way they happened. I can only hold you people responsible. because you're educated, because you know so much, because you have the power and you can call on people, and yet you have got the northern part of Uganda go through what they went through. One of the things I noted that you didn't really let us onto is that Mr. Otono was actually funding the Lord's Resistance Army. And that's how they ended up killing the people in the north. I do not understand how a person, a son of the soil, can go get his sisters and kill them, and then you are blaming it on the president of Uganda. I have nothing to do with the president. He's a president, I can't be a president. He has his own issues. But people, you people who are in there are supposed to be responsible.
Okay.
And I'm really, really deeply disappointed in my sister Helen, a daughter of a genocide survivor. I don't know whether you...
No, I'm not actually.
You're not a genocide?
I'm a different.
Okay. Whatever. Yeah. I do not understand. No, I really don't understand how we can get all the other presidents and make one president be the one to be the leader of them. What is Museveni? What does he have that he should have everybody else, you know, under his skin? That means that the other people don't have a brain, and that's really sad to assume that the other people don't understand. That it's really bad.
And if we can limit to just one question, so let me come back to you. Okay, so we'll come back around. We have another question. Let me come back. We're going to need to wrap up.
Tiffany, let her go. Let her finish.
As for Judi, I would like to know how the minority can occupy both Rwanda and Congo and make atrocities the way you are saying them. One of the things you're forgetting is that the Hutu militia ran to the Congo. So just the fact that they are speaking Kinyarwanda does not make them Batutsi. When we look at how he's saying that it's a government for Tutsi, we had somebody called Kanyarengwe. He was the first president after the whatever. He wasn't a Tutsi.
He wasn't the president.
He was a president. He became a president.
He was not.
So that's really sad. I want us to create our own platform so that when we are talking to the sisters and brothers in America, we are talking about the things that we do understand, not the things that we just formulate because we want to be on a certain side. It's really sad.
Okay, so I think we have two questions on the floor. One about education, particularly the African intellectuals, and then I'll come back around and do another round of three. Another was a book recommendation, and then a concern about the holding to account of not just one leader, but maybe multiple leaders.
I'll be brief. I like dissenting views. Like in my class, I tell my class, no professor, whatever they say is not biblical truth. So always feel free to challenge them. And my students, if any are still here, they'll let you know. They're comfortable challenging me because that's how, you arrive closer to the truth. So the young lady, for example, I don't know whether she meant to say that my father was a bad man or a good man. I didn't get the sense.
He was a very fine person.
Yes, thank you about that. He was a fine person. In fact, General Musavuli awarded him a medal posthumously last year on account of his contribution to Uganda's liberation and independence struggle. My younger brother went to accept the medal. On the same day he accepted the medal on behalf of the family, I published an editorial outlining Musavuli's crimes. So there was no contradiction there. See? The film we saw detailed the atrocities of the Ugandan regime as well as the LRA. The story that has been consistently told is about the atrocities of the LRA. That is why it was important today to tell the story of the Ugandan regime, the atrocities committed by the Ugandan regime. That's what the film is all about. But the young lady has some objection. She claims Olaro Tunu, who was interviewed in the film, he used to be a former Ugandan foreign minister and undersecretary general at the United Nations, was funding the LRA. I think that's preposterous and is not credible. And I don't know where the information comes from, and I'm sure you might hear from him personally. So I'll let him answer that, since I'm not Olaro Tunu. In terms of the education of Africans, I agree with the lady who spoke up. We have all these PhDs. I recommend a short video on YouTube. Google it, go to YouTube, say Julius Nyerere and education. And Nyerere warned about this. So we have all these PhDs, but we're getting the PhDs to hang them on the wall and not to do anything with the PhDs. That's why he said we should always apply the knowledge we have with practical skills that can benefit Africans. In terms of forming our own media outlet, spot on. In fact, I'm getting in touch with a group of other Africans. I want to see if we can organize a conference for next year so we can come up with our media projects. So the lady is spot on. We're actually thinking, thank you. So we're thinking in that direction. And then two other quick points. I like what my brother said in terms of Africans are not savages. That's important because even 40 years after Idi Amin was overthrown, sometimes when I say Uganda, the first thing I hear is Idi Amin. How many people, when they say Germany, the response they get, oh, Hitler. No, you don't get that, right? Or somebody says Russia. Oh, Stalin. You don't get that. So stop treating Africans like that. And then finally, I like the way you brought up Kwame Nkrumah's name in the discussion tonight. I strongly recommend, if you read one thing, read the introduction to his book. Neo-colonialism, the last stage of imperialism. Read only the introduction, 10 pages, but he captures the African crisis then and today. He describes what was going to happen. So the West are not going to let go of our available resources easily. They will find Africans who will undermine our independence. And people like Mobutu belong in that category, and today in the 21st century, Musavuli belongs in that category.
Let's recognize the African media that we have right here, the Black Star News and African Spot.
Just really briefly, so I just want to set the record straight. Alexei Kanyarengwe was never the president of any country. I just want to make sure that that's on the record.
Okay, so we're going to do now another round of three. I think I had 2 hands here, 1, 2, and then get one on this side. Okay, let me come to this young lady here. And I would just, I'm sorry, let me just ask people please limit their remarks to, let's say, 2 minutes, so we can make sure that everybody gets to say something.
And actual questions, not comments.
Comments. Okay, so my questions to the panelists are, how would you, well, what would be your advice for someone like you or someone in my age range to actually be able to gather and start a revolution in the sense of like making a difference? Only reason I ask that is because even as somebody that defines themselves respectful of African American, there's a lot of problems that are going on all over the country with Black people. So with that being said, what would be your advice for someone to actually, you know, get their foot in the door and actually be able to make movement towards building a greater system for our people?
Hi, my name is Maurice Carney from Ghana. And just before I go to my 2 quick points, to say that I was in Rwanda twice this year. One at the invitation of President Kagame for a youth leadership program. And the young people from Africa in the room, many of them asked him, I was at the table when they asked him about DRC and Uganda and all that. He has never denied going into DRC to commit those crimes. So when I see people denying on his behalf, I find it really interesting because he defends it. So maybe some people need to get their facts before they go defending him, because he doesn't deny doing that. He says that he will continue to do it, and he gives reasons for it. My 2 quick points. One, I want to, since it's a US event, I think that it is important for us to keep emphasizing and highlighting the role of US citizens. You are the best people to hold your government accountable. And that starts with electing responsible leaders. And also monitoring and demanding accountability for the atrocities they commit in other parts of the world. The people who are the biggest victims of US intervention and US corporations, they have very little power and have no way of holding these people accountable. So you have a responsibility. It's no longer one of those charity things that some few US people should be doing. It should be a responsibility that you take seriously. My second point has to do with the young people of Africa. The solution is not going to come from anywhere. It's risky, it's dangerous, it's difficult, but young people have to start standing up. You know, if they are too few, it's easy for them to be taken out, but there's no other way. So if there are young people listening, I think in Rwanda, in DRC, in Cameroon, in Togo, in Uganda, you are the only ones who can save your nation. You can have the solidarity of the world, but the responsibility lies on you. And just to recommend that we must also read a book by Kwame Nkrumah, Africa Must Unite, because it's easy, as long as we are divided, it's easy for them to pick up the leaders who are willing to do the dirty job for them, like Musavuli, and support them to be able. But if we are united, we the people can decide who our leaders are, not the West. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Judi Rever. I'm a journalist from Nigeria. And I guess my question is just around rethinking capitalism as an economic system. Because as long as that remains the world order, as long as that remains the dominant economic system, there's just no incentive for Western governments or for the US, in fact, to rethink its foreign policies. Because to be honest, these foreign policies are driven by selfish interests, they're driven by corporate interests. And if you look at the historical context, there's a reason why people like Lumumba in the Congo were exterminated, and there's a reason why people like Sankara were exterminated, because it would affect US interests in the region. So I'm just thinking, if that remains the dominant world order, the atrocities are going to continue. The genocides are going to continue because the people who are profiting off of it want to continue profiting off of it. You know, like that's call a spade a spade. So that's just my question. Like, how can people hear? And I know there are already a lot of people who are opposing it. There are young socialists who are coming up. And maybe socialism isn't entirely the answer, but how will we be thinking capitalism as an economic system to curb that capitalist greed? That's my question. And yeah, and I just also wanted to say we're just collateral damage. In Congo, like I'm a descendant of a genocide survivor, like I'm Igbo. We're all familiar with the Biafra war that happened in Nigeria. So yeah, that's just my question. What are we doing about this system that is very exploitative? And in terms of books to read, The Wretched of the Earth by Fanon.
Yes.
Okay, so if we can take those 3 questions, any panelists want to address the issue of our chosen economic system, that of capitalism and its role in exploitative endeavors around the world. We had some points about the role of youth again.
Oh, and African American.
And the role of African American as descendants of Africans in the diaspora. What role can they play in particular? And Helen, I wonder if you could speak to something. I think you mentioned either in your book or somewhere I saw that some of these are issues that you would think the Black Lives Matter community could take up. I wonder if you could also just maybe touch on that.
Yeah.
Don't forget Kambale.
And Kambale, yes, I know you spoke about the youth. That would be great. In particular order? Okay, we'll start with Helen, then Kambale will come to you.
Yeah, I'll just be very brief. I mean, in terms of getting rid of capitalism, I think that's, we have to soften it, that's for sure, because it's a very, very harsh and gruesome system right now.
Even in this country.
Extremely cruel, yes, indeed. And we need to find ways to regulate these massive, monstrous corporations. Sorry, I hope, can you hear me? Okay. You know, it's we do have, you know, mines all over Canada, mines in Australia, mines in this country, and yet we don't have genocides. There's something specific that's going on, a kind of viciousness towards Africa in particular, and I think that recognizing the true humanity of these people, that they suffer just as much as anybody else does and have the same rights under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as anyone else. Truly to internalize that in our thinking and eventually in our policies, I think is really the first step. There's just such a kind of willful ignorance about this. I think, you know, a lot of times when I get to talking to sort of people who are close to policymakers about these problems that we've been discussing tonight, they all say, oh, but Africa would be a mess anyway. I hear it again and again, and it drives me insane. So, you know, I would love it if Black Lives Matter took this up. They are so well organized, and they are have been so effective in bringing to the fore the humanity of Black Americans, whether it's being frisked on the street or kept in jail forever for smoking marijuana or whatever it might be. And I just wish there was more solidarity with other people of color everywhere who are facing even more grotesque forms of discrimination, really, and neglect of their rights. So, any of you are part of that, please bear it in mind. Thanks.
I'd like to actually chip into that, the same thing. In terms of the sister who asked about African Americans and continental or Africans in the continent, I want to actually exchange information with you at the end of this program. There's an organization that I'm a part of that is actually a co-sponsor of the event tonight, Pan-African Unity Dialogue. We have quarterly meetings, and it involves many Pan-African groups from the Caribbean, from right here in the States, and from continental Africa. And that is the mission of this Pan-African Unity Dialogue. That's what we're actually trying to accomplish. And we always want to get more young people involved. So I'm glad you brought that issue up. I want to make sure I get your information. The young lady who spoke about capitalism, I agree with her. I think Helen actually addressed that already. And we're seeing the harshness, not only in Africa, but we're seeing what it's doing right here in the United States. So much so that the word socialism is not such a dirty word anymore in this country. And for you also, the same young lady, I have another suggestion for you. Go on YouTube and watch Samir Amin, Africa's Challenges of Industrialization. And he talks about that. If African countries try to do it individually, they can't do it. They'll be crushed. Collectively, they can increase their bargaining power.
Thank you. Kambale, would you care to respond on the issue of capitalism or the role of the youth, particularly the youth in diaspora here in the States and elsewhere outside of the continent?
Sure. I heard the echo. I hope you can hear me okay. So December 1st of this year in Ouagadougou, there was an event called Anti-Imperialist Day. It was the third time that this event took place, bringing African youth from across the continent there. So many different organizations. I participated for the first time at the event, and I was pleasantly surprised to meet hundreds of young Africans who are clear about the challenges that they face, specifically around imperialism and capitalism. And the reason why they are very clear, especially East Africa, I was in Burkina, is because they feel directly the impact of imperialism in the region. While there, I was informed that 2 weeks ago, a US drone fell outside of Niamey, the capital city of Niger, and it fell, and this was actually an armed drone. So when you talk to the people, they feel the military presence of Japan, of Italy, of France, and the United States. They see the drones, they see them falling out of the sky, and if he explodes, people are gonna die. They also see the material conditions that they can only be anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist. And they are organizing and mobilizing on the continent, not through Facebook, not through social media, not through emails, and the network and avenue they existed. So as it relates to young Africans on the continent right now, I will make it an appeal to everyone who's in the room to literally reach out to young Africans. I'm not with you because I'm on the African continent at the moment. Connecting with young Africans will also fighting this battle. But I want to bring it back now to the Congolese youth. Well, this event doesn't do it justice because to explain the extent of the youth resistance in the Congo, it may take us 3-4 hours. Now, I kind of mentioned a few names, Rosit Chimanga and Teres Kapangala, just to give them honor that they lost their lives in the struggle. But young Congolese have been very, very consistent in resisting. In their resistance, they're facing a system or a regime that have weapons, they have guns, right? And the people who provide our so-called leaders the weapons are in Washington planning. Right? So Congolese are gonna mobilize, we're gonna hit the street, we're gonna have thousands of people in the streets. But when you see a Congolese police officer looking like an NYPD RoboCop, you have to ask yourself, how did Congolese police get this military equipment for the police?
Kambale, if I can interrupt you quickly. So this is exactly what the young lady is speaking to. In the diaspora here, you have young youth that are trying to plug into what youth on the continent are doing. And they want to know what exactly, as you said, is it putting pressure on Washington? How can they plug in and engage?
2 ways I'm going to propose. The first one is an action. I'm sure there is an action card in the room for the Congolese youth movement. It's telema.org, TELEMA.org. Telema is a Lingala word that means rise up. That's the movement that young Congolese are mobilizing under, and supports that you provide directly to the site. It has action that they provide. For this month right now, they are mobilizing for freeing political prisoners. Young Congolese, some of them have been in jail for almost a year without any charge. So they have direct actions that they put out consistently. That would be one of the things that you do. So I hope you pick up the card. I'm sure they have the postcards in the room. And the website is telema.org. So you can join us, because it's not going to be a one action that you're going to be. It's a movement that we are building. So consistency, staying in touch with us will be important. The second one, that's what I spoke about what's happening in Niger and Niamey, is the actions that I heard it already mentioned about the ending of U.S. military bases on the African continent, Africa. This is something that is very disturbing, very concerning to many of the young Africans. American soldiers are training militaries in Africa. The U.S. government is building military bases across the continent. And in some of the countries where they are operating, the government of these countries are using the military support to oppress the people. But these military bases will not exist if it wasn't for U.S. taxpayers' money. So you work very hard, they take 30 to 40% of your tax every month to go build a U.S. military base on the African continent. So that's a direct action that you can actually do in holding the government accountable. How you do that, the very basic actions. Call your Congress people. I hear that in the Bronx we have a progressive congresswoman who just won, Ocasio-Cortez, I think that's her name. She just got in. why don't we mobilize together here about we should not be supporting military bases. So those are the two actions that we propose: supporting the Congolese youth directly to tell them that the action plan is in the room, and second, bringing them to U.S. military on the African continent.
Kambale, thank you. Very quickly, if you wanted to respond to the question, and I'll take one more round, maybe one or two more rounds of questions.
Yes. Yes. Well, she mentioned a number of things. One of the things that she mentioned that was historically inaccurate is that she suggested that Hutu militia, Rwandan Hutu militia who were in Congo might have been responsible for the killing of Hutu refugees. That's just not true. The attacks on the Hutu refugee camps in the eastern part of Zaire were well documented. Kagame himself has taken credit for busting up, as he said, those camps, and he actually said that his troops and all human rights organizations, including the UN Office of the Human Rights, documented how these troops chased refugees across the entire country and killed an estimated 200,000 of them. Now, Hutu elements, Hutu militia elements, and former members of the Hutu army were part of the refugee population, but they actually fled earlier and got to Congo-Brazzaville earlier, those who survived those attacks. So there's no evidence to suggest that Hutu militia would have actually killed their own Hutu refugee population.
I want to translate something that Kagame, the president of Rwanda, said on April 13, 2010, in a speech in Parliament. He said, "We went to the Congo. Those we wanted to shoot, we shot them. Those we wanted to kill, we killed them. And those that we wanted to bring back by force, we brought them back to the country." That was his own speech.
Thank you. Can we get maybe 3 final questions? Lady in the front. And I just ask you to keep them down to 1 minute. I want to make sure people have enough time for the books and have their books done.
Yeah, that's.
So thank you for all the presentation. I'm really passionate about the Great Lake region. I wish you would have touched more about what's happening in Burundi right now. It seems like there's a bit of a shift in the region, so if someone wants to give us more information what's happening in Burundi right now. My other question is about the youth in Congo and the election. It seems to be overshadowing everything that's happening outside of the election. For instance, the U.S. just elected a new envoy to the Great Lake region, Peter James Pham. And then today, I believe it was John Bolton was talking about how the U.S. wants to go into Africa and fight everything that Russia and China is doing there. So it seems like they want to have the Cold War in Africa.
Yeah.
So it's just like, how do you bring the message there in the chaos of the election? That last.
That's great. Thank you. Any other takers? One more? Thought I saw a hand? All right.
Yeah, I have to thank the panelists. This was very, very educational. I didn't know the story about the northern Uganda that much, but I know more about Rwanda and Congo because I have family in both countries and I grew up in both countries. And I can talk to the sister about Burundi also. I know a little bit about Burundi. So, but just to share one thing or two. How the lady she just mentioned about the RPF going into Congo and killing the refugees is that we probably didn't mention this part. Do you remember the Operation Turquoise?
Yes.
With the French?
Yes.
So the mistake that was that it was in the Congo was that usually by international law, if a refugee can come in your country, you don't support to let him go into your country with guns. So the militias and the army that was running away from Rwanda, who was running into Congo, the Congolese army let them in with arms and bombs and all that kind of thing into Congo. So that's one thing. So the second thing that I want to mention was that I sympathize with my brother. We went through this a lot with him. We're good friends and we talk over back and forth with Claude and I. We're not saying that there was no Hutus who did not die. We're saying that both of them, we both lost Tutsis, we lost Hutus. But there is two cases that we have to think about in the case of Hutus in one hand. Most of the Hutus who died, they are the ones who are protecting Tutsis from getting killed.
Yeah, exactly.
And the second thing was most of Hutus who died, here I'm talking about within Rwanda. I'm not talking about in the Congo part. And the second part was that the ones who were sympathizing with the RPF and refusing to commit the genocide, they were killed by their partners, Hutus, within the country. So that's something that I know. The other thing that I can mention was about, it's very complicated, it was very vague when you were explaining the genocide. By definition, the UN actually came up with the genocide against the Tutsis in Rwanda. We never say that. We say that it was an atrocity against Tutsis. And there was a resolution at the UN that came up with that word saying that there was a Tutsi genocide in Rwanda. That's the word that is used right now. So I just want to add that to the thing. So for the
Sorry. Thank you so much. Okay. One very quick. Yeah, I'm sorry, I caught her before. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Eunice. I'm going to be very quick. I don't want to take sides because I have been a victim of both sides, whatever. I was in Uganda, I grew up in Uganda during Amin's time. We suffered a lot from the armies from the north, the northern people. They were coming and killing everybody. What I'm trying to say here, before we all get up and kill each other and blame each other for all this, each person is individually has a responsibility to take care of a life. If you have a leader who sends you to go and kill people, you can say no. Like the Hutus who died protecting the Tutsis. So all these things that people talk about between Hutu and Tutsi, and people today in Rwanda are living together peacefully. The same people who killed each other. Why do you think it's like that? So all I'm trying to say is, please, let's sensitize, let's say the truth, let's bring the truth out, but also we have to take responsibilities and take responsibility for ourselves and make sure that those things don't happen on either side. Two, stopping aid, in my opinion, is not going to clear all the issues. Because when you stop aid, there are also children who benefit from that aid, however little it is. So the best thing to do if you are going to aid education.
Military aid is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Give education, train on ethics, train on human rights, train on good governance. Somebody cannot come from outside, come to your house and tell you how to live and think that they are going to survive. The whole thing that caused Africa to be where it is people coming and bringing ideas that Africans don't understand and try to implement them. So let Africa own their own countries. Let them govern themselves the way they want to govern. That's what I wanted to say. But you can't expect America to come and help us. You can't expect Australia to come and help us. All we have to do is, why can't Africans ourselves help ourselves and say no to all these ideologies that come and confuse us and make us kill each other? That's all I can say.
They have to get up the leash.
Okay, so some comments about what's happening in Burundi, if someone can speak to that. Clarifications around the genocide. There's a comment about self-sufficiency.
I can answer a couple of those, but not the one on Burundi per se. But
okay. So anybody want to speak to Burundi really quickly?
Quickly, just give a... I can give a quick summary on Burundi. There's a number of developments in Burundi. The latest being that's making news, the indictment of former President Pierre Buyoya, who is implicated in the murder, the torture and murder of the first democratically elected president in Burundi that set off the war in Burundi. A lot of people see this as political expediency by the current Burundian president because he's also in a lot of trouble. And he's basically using it to popularize himself. I think it's the right thing to do. Nobody should start a war and get away with it. Nobody should get that many Africans killed and get away with it. So he should absolutely be prosecuted. But I do think that to do it for political brownie points it can be dangerous. But I support, just like I supported when Hissène Habré was taken to court and persecuted and convicted for killing all those people in Chad, and Charles Taylor killing the Liberians, and a lot of other African dictators who deserve and have earned their time in a jail cell, to think about all of the African victims that they've killed and all of the sponsors who are just sitting there and laughing at them, because that's what happened to Hissène Habré, and that's what happened to Mobutu Sese Seko, who supported apartheid. And then the US turned around and supported those who toppled him, Museveni and Kagame. And Kagame and Museveni's time will also come, but they should absolutely pay the price for being the slave traders of African lives.
I wanted to address the questions the gentleman raised about the first one, I think, about most of the Hutus you said who were killed were those resisting to kill Tutsis. There's that phenomenon where Hutus were targeted for resisting the killing by Hutu militia. There is that phenomenon, and that's well documented. But it's not correct to say that most of the Hutus who died during 1994 were killed for trying to protect Tutsi. Most of the Hutus who died in the several hundreds of thousands were killed by the Rwandan Patriotic Front in well-organized massacres behind the front that I tried to synthetically describe before, from the north, down the east, up to the middle of the country, then down south again, up to the northeast. That is how most Hutus died. Because you mentioned the Tutsi genocide. I'm not sure if you're questioning whether there was a genocide against Tutsis. There was a genocide against Tutsis in 1994. Tutsis were threatened and died in massive numbers in every Hutu-controlled zone of Rwanda, but those zones were, a lot of the forces or the people responsible for those killings were Hutu militia, and they were ousted and fled fairly quickly, and the RPF went into those zones. Now, after the RPF went into those zones, curiously, a lot of Tutsis died after that. In false flags and in operations where they simply were not protected, or they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And concurrent, there was also the other phenomenon where, as I said, RPF commandos infiltrated Hutu militias and killed Tutsis at the same time. So there was a lot going on. Now, to answer your comment about Opération Turquoise, there's been a lot of propaganda by the Rwandan regime about what the French did or did not do, and the standard accusation is that the French let armed Hutus go into Zaire. First of all, the context in which armed elements among the
Hutu refugee population fled to Zaire. The context in which that happened was a bi-directional violence. So the RPF was killing Hutus, and the Hutus had been killing, Hutu militias had been killing Tutsis. And so Opération Turquoise got underway at the end of June. And in fact, the RPF controlled most of the country by then. So if there was any particular military force that allowed the borders, allowed people to flee, or was responsible for people fleeing, that would have been the RPF. I think there's a lot of fault on both sides.
Thank you. Milton, if you can make your...
Very quick. There's a chapter in my book also that I also focus on the war itself in Rwanda, and then the genocide of the Tutsi genocide as well. But there's an article that I encountered that I wrote about, and I just want to read very quickly from it. There are other contemporaneous reports that, in retrospect, raise questions about the Kagame as savior narrative. On September 5, 1994, the New York Times published an article written by the reporter Raymond Bonner under the headline, "Mass Killings by Rwandan Rebels Are Reported." Bonner, a seasoned and respected reporter, had once broken the story about the El Mozote massacre of up to 800 civilians by the military during El Salvador's civil war. In his Rwanda article, Bonner reported that witnesses told him that RPF soldiers had indiscriminately killed both Hutus and Tutsis. This was an interesting report because at the time, every Western media outlet reported only on killings committed by the Interahamwe, as the Hutu militias engaged in the massacres of Tutsis were known. On this occasion, though, one witness quoted by Bonner said, quote, "The Interahamwe killed the Tutsis, while the RPF killed everyone, Hutu and Tutsis, without asking for identification cards." This account lends credence to critics who believe the RPF's goal was to maximize the body count regardless of the victim's ethnicity. The goal was then to blame the Habyarimana regime for the killings and discredit it in the eyes of the world. The more the bodies, including the ones committed by the RPF, and blamed on Habyarimana, the more effective such a strategy. So that article was from the New York Times, actually.
We'd like to have closing remarks. I know in the interest of time, maybe a few other people wanted to say something. I encourage you to come and speak with the panelists afterwards. We're going to close out the program and then have people purchase their books.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Tiffany. Please give a round of applause to Tiffany and the moderation. Oh, and Michael Kilpatrick's here. He's in the film as well. I want to thank you for coming out.
Yeah, I just want to mention uncredited in the film for a reason, but I was the bearded white man in the film. Much younger. Yes. Yes, thank you. And I clean up very well. So, but thank you. Thank you all for your panel.
All right, just quickly, again, we organize these events so that you can be educated politically, you can be informed, but also so that you can take action. On the sheet, the program book, you see the 3 actions at the back. Please take a look at that. Number 1, we talked about signing the petition. Go to blackallianceforpeace.com to sign the petition to abolish AFRICOM. Number 2, we'd like for you to sign up with us, to volunteer, to sign petitions, to write letters, to get involved. And in order for you to do that, you can go to friendsofthecongo.org. Friendsofthecongo.org. It's on the postcard that each and every one of you received in order to sign up to join the movement. Because we're engaged in the movement here in the U.S., but also here in the U.S. and pressuring the U.S. government and trying to change U.S. foreign policy, but also on the ground in Africa and supporting social movements throughout the African continent, particularly in the Congo. And it costs money to put these events together and to organize, so we'd like for you to make a contribution to our work. You can do that outside at the end, or you can go to our website, especially for those people online, friendsofthecongo.org in order to make a financial contribution. And the last website I'd like for you to visit is Telema, T-E-L-E-M-A, telema.org. If you sign up tonight, we'll capture your information and we'll get back to you right away and let you know concrete actions that you can take in order to keep this movement going. The movement of putting pressure on the U.S. government to change its foreign policy and also providing support to social justice movements on the African continent. Again, thank you all very much for coming out tonight and staying this long with us. And again, please give our panelists and our moderators a round of applause. We're going to have a book signing outside. Judi, Milton, and Helen. They have their books outside, so please come outside, purchase a book, get them signed, and thank you very much.
Can you spell Telema?